Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Just for any of you that haven't been on our webinar site before, just to go over a couple of things that you can just point out the features here. So if you're interested in putting the slides on full screen while the webinar is running, you just click that little symbol there. We'll have an opportunity for questions at the end of the webinar, but if anyone wants to ask a question during the webinar, you can just type in a question at the bottom of your screen just there. The other thing that we'd ask is that you mute your phone unless you do have to ask a question, and that just prevents some feedback on the line. Okay, so to start off, I just want to talk about the Centre of Excellence and the genesis of the Centre of Excellence. So the AFAC Rural and Land Management Group and the Forest Fire Management Group, who I'll refer to as FFMG, several years ago looked at getting some consistent principles around prescribed burning around the country, and they started the National Burning Project. At the same time, people were visiting overseas and seeing models for centres that were drawing in a number of people around the country into various organisations that worked towards collaboration in prescribed burning. So those members came back and for AFAC and FFMG and started talking about setting up a Centre of Excellence in Australia. So the idea was that the centre would be a virtual centre, and at the same time as the National Burning Project was starting to wrap up, we could see as a Centre of Excellence as a great repository for all the groundbreaking work that the National Burning Project did. So the Centre of Excellence is an initiative of AFAC and FFMG, and it's going to have an advisory group drawn from members of both of those organisations. The other thing about the Centre of Excellence is that with its knowledge hub, there was another existing organisation under the AFAC umbrella called the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience that had the structure in the website for hosting a bunch of, called a knowledge hub, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So at this stage, I just would like to hand over to Neil Cooper, who is the chairman of FFMG. He's also on the AFAC Council and AFAC board. He's director of roads and forests for the ACT Parks and Conservation Service, and I think Neil's got a few words to say about the benefits that he can see for the Centre of Excellence.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. Deb, I'll be fairly short. Basically, I think, as you've explained, the Prescribed Burning Centre of Excellence has evolved over a number of years of work from FFMG and AFAC, and I think the scrutiny that we land managers and fire and emergency agencies are under at the moment when implementing prescribed fire is only going to get harder into the future. There's questions about, do we need to do it, smoke management, etc. And I think by bringing all that knowledge into one central location, which is going to be the Centre of Excellence, all of us can then sort of rest on our laurels a fair bit and say that we are using best practice across Australia. And really, when it's best practice across Australia, that's almost best practice across the world, because Australia is looked to, certainly I was over in US and Canada recently, and they are really looking at what we're doing in the prescribed burning space, and they are very, very excited about this idea of a Centre of Excellence where all the most recent research can be collated, updated and disseminated. So, and I think the other thing, just finishing off, the other thing is that everyone should be aware that this Prescribed Burning Centre of Excellence fits perfectly under our national fire policy. We do have a national fire policy. Some people may not be aware of that. But that was endorsed by every Premier and Chief Minister from across Australia, plus the Prime Minister, and is a direction forward about how we use fire in the landscape. And I think this is going to be a perfect mechanism to deliver that. So that's all I've got, Deb.
Great. Thank you, Neil. So just to move on, I want to talk a little bit about the products that came out of the National Burning Project, because they are the principles and policies and guidelines and frameworks that the Centre of Excellence will be concentrating on disseminating across the country. So it's really good to get an understanding of the products and what they can do for you in your prescribed burning place. So as I said at the beginning, we wanted to, AFAC and FFMG wanted to synthesise all the different approaches across Australia to prescribe burning, and bring them together into some national frameworks and work towards united understanding of what prescribed burning is, how it can be used, and a safe way of implementing it. So the project took place over 6 years, and it actually did deliver quite a number of products in that space. So I know that looks like a bit of a confusion of documents there, but I am going to work through them one by one and give you a bit of an understanding of what they are. So the first one is the national position, which was a directive of the Forest Fire Management Group and AFAC to have a national position that they could refer to in their group amongst themselves. So the position, as it's stated there, is that AFAC and FFMG member agencies take the position that prescribed burning is an essential part of bushfire mitigation across the Australian landscape to reduce risk to communities and ecological health. So that's the stated position that's been endorsed by COAG, and also has been picked up by a number of agencies across the world that are interested, particularly in the 10 principles that you see outlined underneath there. So the first one was obviously protection of life is the highest consideration. That factors into a number of agency documents around their prescribed burning programs. And the second one that's always stated too is that landscape health is linked to fire and fire management. And the following 8 principles under that talk about why we use prescribed burning and how to use it. So making sure that you've got good community engagement, that you're acknowledging traditional owners, that you've got an integrated approach across the landscape to get the best benefit out of your prescribed burning program. So that's a key document that's come out of the National Burning Project. The next one I want to look at is so the best practice guidelines that were developed. So the first thing that was done was a review of best practice across the country, and 177 agency documents were consulted and reviewed to have a look at what was considered to be best practice. And this document looks at that, and it looks at the north and south of Australia. They're quite different environments that they're operating in. And as you can see in that picture, the number of fires that they have across the north of Australia is what lends to that different approach to prescribed burning. So from those best practice principles, we developed the idea of doing these case studies. So these 9 case studies look at each individual jurisdiction. They look at different fuel types. They look at some landscape burning, they look at rural interface burning, and so those 9 case studies were done and were used to then derive the best practice guidelines. So there's best practice for strategic and program planning, and then there's the best practice for burn operations and your actual burn implementation. So what we've done too with those documents is they're quite lengthy documents, so we've pulled them into this synopsis of just the key principles. So just to give you a little bit of a glimpse of what's inside that document is, so this is your strategic plan, scope and principles. There's principle 1, and then it gives you a key action, and then it relates it back to the original document where you can go for more information about that particular principle. One thing to note with all of our documentation is that we looked at the prescribed burning process from the strategic planning right down to burn implementation. So that's a consistent structure of all our documentation that looks at those 4 phases of burn implementation, and also looks at the fact that throughout that burn planning process you need to have your objectives and your consultation and communication happening all the way down, and then from the bottom up you need to be monitoring and evaluating your prescribed burning program to ensure that it's achieving the results that you want. So the next lot of documents is the risk framework. So we did 4 risk frameworks. There's the ecological risks, there's fuel hazards risks, there's operational risks, and there's smoke management. Again, with those 4 documents, to find the actual frameworks is not an easy task. So that document on the far right there is a synopsis of the actual 4 risk framework. And again, you can see this is a generic look at what those risk frameworks look like, but they all look at identifying, analysing and deciding what to do about your risk. And as you can see, the communication and consultation and the research, monitoring and evaluation goes through all of that, and then reviewing that your risk management strategies are actually working. So the next lot of documents to look at is actually your objectives and performance measures and monitoring how your prescribed burning planning is going. So we have a objectives monitoring and evaluation framework that again is a principle-driven thing. It doesn't tell you which metrics you need to use or what your surveying method should be. It says that that this should be integrated into your whole prescribed burn plan. So the next document there is the program logic for prescribed burning. So that lays out all the inputs to your prescribed burn plan, your outcomes, and the activities around achieving those outcomes. Then the 2 other documents that we have around objectives and performance measures. So under that program logic, there's a number of performance measures that you can use to assess how you're going with your program. So that document is in production, and there's 22 measures in there that will help you with your prescribed burn planning. So whether it's a financial performance measure, whether it's an ecological performance measure, whether it's a one of them could be, you know, the number of hectares that you've burnt. The other one is your objective setting tool. So with that one, it's a spreadsheet where you start off with a baseline understanding of what your prescribed burn plan does and its cost, and then you start to change some of the inputs. So it might be the percentage of land you burn on private property as opposed to public property, or it might be how much you do in the landscape as opposed to next to your urban interface, and you then get a whole bunch of costs associated with that, and whether it be the number of houses that you might save or the number of gas pipelines you might save, and then you can start to weigh what the benefit and cost is against those different scenarios. So that tool is forthcoming, and we'll be running a webinar about that in the future as well. So bringing all those documents together, we put this process map together. So basically, it's a step-by-step guide for how to start your prescribed burn planning. So that's the process map, and inside you can see there the step-by-step. So we're looking there at operational planning phase, and then in each step it lists what the documents are that give you some further information about how to undertake that step. So one thing to note about these principles and steps is they're not necessarily sequential or chronological, but they probably all need to be considered when you do your prescribed burn planning. We also reviewed the training resource material that was out there for prescribed burn planning, or training that was out there for prescribed burn planning or training up your prescribed burners. So these new documents actually embed these national guidelines and the process map into them. So you're looking there at, there's 5 competencies, but we've got 3 manuals. So simple prescribed burns will actually covers off developing a prescribed burn and conducting a prescribed burn, because in some agencies one person does the whole job, so in others they don't, but that was just the best way of presenting all the information, because a lot of the theory is the same across those 2 competencies. We also did a number of reviews. So the first one was the overview of prescribed burning. So that's a really handy guide for anyone who's not in the prescribed burning place to understand why prescribed burning is a tool that's used in Australia. The next one along is our science review that is gathering together some of the more current thinking around the science of prescribed burning. But not only that, it's bringing in some practitioner viewpoints and some of the social understanding of prescribed burning as well. So it should be a really great book for anyone who, the idea was that it would be if you had to go to an inquiry, instead of 27 different people putting in submissions about prescribed burning, that it would contain all of that information in one area. The other reviews we did was a training review. So we looked at the way training is delivered across the jurisdictions and whether there was some way that it could be streamlined and brought together into some sort of national training facility. Those recommendations within that review will be picked up by the advisory group of the Centre of Excellence for prioritisation and implementation, and the same with the capability assessment. So that was looking at sharing of resources, whether that be physical resources or personnel across borders for prescribed burning, a little bit like the National Resource Sharing Centre that's in operation now, but whether you could have a crew of people working their way around the country following prescribed burn season. So again, the recommendations within that report will be looked at by the Centre of Excellence Advisory Group for prioritisation and implementation. The last part of the National Burning Project was to put together a toolbox. So that's a way of presenting tools to people across the country who might be looking for a new and innovative way of making decisions around their prescribed burning. So some examples of that would be the objectives analysis tool that we've put together. When that's finalised, that will be in the toolbox. Another one is the prescribed burning decision support tool, which was developed by the ACT Parks and Conservation Service. At this stage, many of the tools, it will just be an information sheet that tells you what the tool does and the the highlights of the tool and with contact details, because there's a lot of issues that we need to overcome in terms of intellectual property within those tools, and also version control, and making sure that people who use the tool actually have an understanding of how to use it. So in the short term, that toolbox will just be listing the tools rather than having the tools themselves. But there's some great tools out there that agencies are not aware of that could be shared across the country. So that's a really great outcome of the National Burning Project as well. So all of these documents are now sitting within the Centre of Excellence, and just wanted to start talking about what some of the objectives of the Centre of Excellence are. And the first one is to finalise off on those documents that you just saw that were coming soon. So the objectives analysis, we'll put it in the toolbox. We'll have a webinar on it. Performance measures, we're in the process of actually editing that report for publication, and we will have a webinar on it, and there'll be some further work done at AFAC, Rural and Land Management Group, and FFMG to see if any of those performance measures could be used on an annual national basis for reporting to government. The toolbox is underway, so that will be appearing on the Knowledge Hub soon. The training and capability reviews, as I said, the Centre of Excellence Advisory Group will look at those recommendations. And the science review, we're just waiting on a number of authors to finalise their submissions before we start editing the book for publication. So that was the first objective of the Centre of Excellence. The second the second objective was to actually start communicating the National Burning Project products out to the agency. So during the formulation of the product, a number of key personnel from agencies were involved in the steering committee and some technical reference groups, but agency staff on the ground were not involved in that process. So what we wanted to do was get out there and talk to agency staff. So that's what we've actually focused on for the first 6 months of the Centre of Excellence. We've been to a number of conferences around Australia and New Zealand. We've talked at forums, we've talked at fire management group meetings within agencies. We've also got a number of other communication activities that we're going to undertake this year, including international conferences and aligning with some study tours with some international guests from the US and Mexico and Canada. So this is the great initiative that we've got up and running just this month. As you know, we've got this webinar series up and running. So some of the topics that we're going to cover off in the upcoming months are we're going to have a presentation on that prescribed burning decision support tool that I talked about from the ACT. We've got a panel session ready for a 10-year inclusive burning webinar. We'll have a closer look at that objectives analysis tool. We'll look at performance measures and the program logic. We'll look at some of the metrics for ecological monitoring, and AFAC and FFMG have been looking at some of the doctrine around hazardous trees. So we'll be presenting that hazardous trees doctrine. So the other great initiative is the Prescribed Burning Practitioners Network. So we've now got that up and running, and I will talk about that a little bit later in the actual network. But the idea behind it was that through the National Burning Project, when we had workshops to talk about the documentation that we were putting together, we got such great feedback from people that they just thoroughly appreciated the experience to be able to talk to other prescribed burning practitioners around the country. So we've levered off that excitement and understood that, you know, people have actually been quite siloed within the agencies, and they really love that opportunity to talk. So we've got this network up. It's an online network for the moment, but we're looking to have at least biannual forums around prescribed burning, where people who are just focused on that can get together and talk. So it's not as grand as the AFAT conference, for instance, which is all about emergency management. It's actually really focused down on that prescribed burning, and we can see a real need for people to do that. So we'll be working towards that over the next 12 to 18 months. Sorry, my slides are not showing up as they were formatted, so apologies for that. So the other one we wanted to do is ensure that the knowledge that was out there was in a place where everyone could access. So we've set up the Knowledge Hub on the ADA website, as I alluded to earlier in the presentation. And later in the presentation, I'll actually take you through that Knowledge Hub. But some of the current resource pages we have are the guidelines and frameworks from the National Burning Project. And we've set up a page around cultural burning and traditional owners. There's some great information out there about how to liaise with traditional owners if you wanted to include them in your prescribed burning program. We'll also have some upcoming resource pages. So we'll have one specifically dedicated to this webinar series, where the video, we'll be recording the webinars and uploading them onto the web, and also any of the slides associated with them. The toolbox, as I've alluded to before, and research and utilisation. So that might be lessons learned, or it might be conference proceedings, or it might be things coming out of the Bushfire and Natural Hazard CRC or other organisations that are dealing with research in prescribed burning. And the idea is to actually synthesise that research and put it into a format that is readily accessible to prescribed burners to understand what that research can help them with. So we also want to facilitate leadership and mentoring for staff capability. But the key concepts of the Centre of Excellence is increasing capability across the sector. So we're looking at ways that we can facilitate cross-agency attendance at prescribed burns, whether that just be an informal thing across jurisdictional borders, or whether it's an actual formal way of setting up burns where a number of staff can attend, where they're learning something outside of their normal operating environment, whether it's having someone go up north to learn about how they deal with fires in the north, or vice versa. As I mentioned, there's a study tour of North American fire managers coming over to Australia later in the year, so we're looking at whether we can emulate that within Australia with Australian staff and visiting other regions within the country, not necessarily just attending burns. And the other initiative that we've got going is registering and certifying burn OICs through the Emergency Management Professionalisation Scheme. That scheme at the moment is registering and certifying Incident 3 level controllers, but there's been noted that sometimes people who an OIC at a prescribed burn need a different set of skills to just controlling an incident. So we're looking at what that specific skill set is, and then having people on that register or certification scheme. And the last objective of the Centre of Excellence is to ensure its ongoing sustainability. So at the moment, it's not really any secret that the funding for the Centre of Excellence is coming out of unexpended funds of the National Burning Project. but we need to look at how we can build a centre and fund it into the future. So one way of doing that is we've set up this governance structure within AFAC and FFMG to oversee that with the advisory committee. We're developing a strategic plan with some finances in it so that we can determine how much it's going to cost, and then we'll be looking at some of the funding models that we might pursue to ensure that the Centre of Excellence can keep going into the future. So that really covers off on the National Burning Project document and the way the Centre of Excellence is shaping up and looking. What I'd like to do now is actually run you through what we have online for you so that you're aware of the products and groups that we've set up there. So just bear with me while I bring that up. Okay, so the first thing is the knowledge hub that we've got on the website for the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. So if you can't remember the website that I show you at the end of the presentation, just remember aidr.org.au. If you log into there, then you can follow through and click on to the knowledge hub. And then you want to look at the collections and the Centre of Excellence for Prescribed Burning collection. So this is really the front page for the Centre of Excellence. So this is where you can join the online practitioner network. You can subscribe to our newsletter. So that will be a quarterly newsletter, but we'll also be using that newsletter as a way of disseminating the webinar series and what's coming up in that. It will list what the upcoming webinars are. It links through to our Facebook page, and then we link through to the resource pages. So the National Prescribed Burning Guidelines and Frameworks, that's all the National Burning Project products. But it also, apart from all those products that I've just shown you, has the document that Neil alluded to, the National Bushfire Management Policy Statement for Forest and Rangelands. So that's within that website as well. And the other one is traditional owners and cultural burning. So we've got a few documents on there now. So the protocols for Indigenous fire management and partnerships came out of a meeting in the Northern Territory, I think mid-2016. So all those documents are there. There's a case study there from Western Australia where they've implemented Indigenous Australians into and cultural burning. All those resource pages that I talked about with the research and utilisation and the toolbox will come up in that Centre of Excellence collections page there over time. So the other thing was the Prescribed Burning Practitioners Network. So I know not everyone is on Facebook, but in terms of setting up another site where people had to log into and actually engage with each other, we decided that Facebook was actually probably the best medium for this because it's a far more interactive thing. The idea of the Practitioners Network is to enable conversations across the country. So, for instance, I've had people come to me and say, Deb, can you tell me, has anyone got experience in dealing with contractors in prescribed burning? And as it happened, I did know someone that did, so I could put them in touch. Or the other one was someone who was looking for someone who had developed a training program and wanting some advice. So I could put those in touch. But rather than everything funneling through me, and I may not have the answer, the idea of this online practitioners network is to enable you to elicit or solicit advice from your peers across the country. So it's just beginning, and so far we've got about 40 people within that network. I'd like to grow it to the full 300 to 400 people that I've spoken to across the country in the last 6 months, at the very least. So that, as I said, it's only been up for a couple of weeks. So I'm relying on people listening to this webinar to spread the word. We also have a Facebook page. So the newsletter that I want to send out it's not, I don't want to fill people's emails up with newsletters that they don't read. So the idea is that this Facebook page is a place where I can post things that I hear about as I hear about them, for people to know that information is out there and that they can access it. So it's a far more interactive and on-the-go kind of way of disseminating information. So there's that opportunity as well. So I'll just click back to those slides now. So that's actually the end of the presentation about the Centre of Excellence and the National Burning Projects for today. All the websites that I've spoken about are listed on this page, and I will be putting these slides up on the website as soon as I can, and the video will maybe take a week or two to get ready and post. So I'm going to pause there and ask if anyone has any questions or comments that they'd like to share. Okay, I'll take that silence as a vote of confidence, and thank you all for attending the webinar today, and we look forward to continuing our association with you all. Thank you.
Deb, it's Coop.
Yes, Neil.
Yeah, just one really quick one. I think the challenge we're going to have is how we take this forward. As you mentioned, there's still some funding to see this through to the end of the year, I think. But I think one of the big things is how we as agencies across Australia try and develop this, because, you know, really, if we can show that we're all linked to national best practice through the Centre of Excellence, I think individually in each state and agency will be far better positioned to deliver prescribed burning. So I think that's a challenge.
Yep.
So more comments.
Yeah, one of the things that the centre needs to do is actually determine some performance measures for its own performance, I guess. So, and that's a really hard thing to do. We can talk about how many people receive our newsletter. We can talk about how many people are signed up on the email list, but we can't really determine how people are implementing the best practice within their agencies, and that's something that I think the advisory committee will be instrumental in putting that together.
And I think we get stuff on the ground as well. You know, like webinars are fine, although this is the first one I've ever been in, and I've lost you halfway through. They're all great, and they're part of the story. But I think, you know, how do we get people trained up to the same standard? How do we have confidence, you know, that everyone is doing burning to national best practice? I think there's some of the challenges, and getting some on-ground stuff, you know, some actual training on the ground, I think is where we need to be.
Absolutely, Neil. So the report on the training recommendations looks at a number of ways that we can do that, and again, that the Centre of Excellence is going to have to work through how we're going to implement some of those recommendations, especially when jurisdictions are quite wedded to their own training programs. So we've made a start by putting the best practice principles into those training resource kits, and I know a lot of agencies are using those, but extending that beyond the AFAC membership and knowing that private landholders or traditional owner groups that are doing their burning, or contractors that do prescribed burning, implementing it as well is going to be a challenge that the Centre of Excellence is going to have to think long and hard about. Okay, any other questions or comments there? Okay, well, again, I'll say thank you, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you all on the ground or out and about. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Deb.